booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome, listeners, to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Today, we are talking about The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Belle, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Okay, hi. Hi, Naomi, and thanks for inviting me to be part of your amazing initiative. It's really a great idea. To answer your question about who I am, I come from a family that for generations were readers, teachers, and writers. I mean, we joke that our family exercise is aerobic reading. So I was born during the post-war baby boom. I grew up in a Queens, New York neighborhood surrounded by many first-generation Jewish kids whose families had lost people in the Holocaust. And in our neighborhood, education was everything. You had to do well in school. Nothing was more important. It was a big school, too. It was a culture of strivers, and achievement was about much more than financial. In fact, a very large percentage of my high school buddies went on to earn advanced degrees. There were lots of professors and professionals. It was a pretty remarkable moment in time. And as a result, education has always been important to me, and at the core of that are books. So I studied language and literature in college, got a master's in education, and spent 47 years doing strategy in the advertising business, surrounded by curious people who were writers and readers. And so at work, what I was about was culture and what makes people do and buy what they do and buy. And I'm just horrified that communities ban books. And I look forward to talking about this book.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I look forward to this discussion too. But first, we're going to put the book in context. Set during the Great Depression, the novel follows the Joad family, who are tenant farmers from Oklahoma that are driven off their land by the combined forces of the Dust Bowl and bank foreclosures. They join thousands of other Okies on a desperate migration west along Highway 66 toward California, which they believe to be a promised land of high wages and abundant fruit-picking jobs. The journey is grueling. The family endures death and desertion along the way, and they face constant mechanical failures and dwindling resources. Upon arriving in California, they find the reality is not what was advertised. The labor market is oversaturated, wages are kept starvation low by powerful landowners, and migrants are treated with hostility and violence. The story's emotional core centers on Tom Joad, who evolves from a self-interested ex-convict into a social activist, and Ma Joad, the resilient matriarch struggling to keep her family from falling apart. The novel ends on a haunting symbolic note of human survival and communal sacrifice during a devastating flood that is on the cusp of the coming winter with no work prospects and no money or food stores. When The Grapes of Wrath was published in 1939, it didn't just top bestseller lists. It ignited a national firestorm. It remains a fixture on banned book lists, or remained on there for several years, and for several distinct reasons. First, for its political ideology. Critics and powerful agricultural groups labeled Steinbeck a communist, which angered him. This book is not the muckraking propaganda of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is basically a love letter to Marxism. They argued that the book's critique of capitalism and empathy for the plight of migrant workers were subversive propaganda designed to incite a workers' revolution. Another reason was slander against California. In Kern County, California, the very place the Joads sought refuge, the book was officially banned and even publicly burned. Local officials and landowners felt Steinbeck portrayed them as inhumane vigilantes and blood-sucking exploiters. Though, you have to comment if the shoe fits. The book was also banned for offensive content and language. For the era, the book's use of profanity was considered scandalous. Religious groups also took issue with what they perceived as a lack of moral values and the controversial final scene involving Rose of Sharon. The reaction from Oklahoma was not much better. Many in Oklahoma felt that the book insulted their state by depicting its citizens as ignorant or backward. Congressman Lyle Boren famously denounced the book as, quote, a lie, a black infernal creation of a twisted, distorted mind, unquote. The backlash was so intense that it helped inspire the American Library Association to adopt the Library Bill of Rights, a fundamental document protecting the freedom to read. Now that we have some context, let's begin. I have a personal connection to the book. I read it in high school and again in college. And for college, I was in a history capstone seminar, which had a theme of the Great Depression. We read the book, but also had to collect oral histories. One of the oral histories I collected was my father, who spent most of the 1930s in the back of the truck with 8 of his 9 other siblings and their dad, driving around the Southwest, picking cotton and fruit. They weren't trying to get to California. Nobody died, but they had lost the family farm and didn't have anything else. So that's what they did. Parts of this book definitely resonate for me. Belle, to start us off, tell us why you chose The Grapes of Wrath and why this story particularly resonates for you.
So, it's interesting. I read this book in high school too, but I don't remember loving it in high school. And then I didn't read it in college. I read a lot of French literature. At some point in my 40s, I guess, I was a mom with kids. I was doing my career. And I always try to be in more than one book club. And some book club decided we were going to do American classics and picked this one. And we just devoured it. We read the reviews, we watched the movie, we dissected it. And I guess it's really just the story of families needing to leave home in search of a better life, which I think is so universal. The notion that people don't get that, don't see how that transfers from one group to another, to me, is both horrifying and unconscionable. I think a lot about media, what we have today and what they had or didn't have in 1940 in the States and in Europe. And I think it is just fantastic that he used the medium he had to really express such important issues. The communist thing, well, he wasn't a communist, but the idea that you had this at your disposal and you could write about it, to me, is just fantastic. If he had social media, he could have used that, but this is what he had. And I think it's just an amazing, amazing creation.
Great. I think you're right. It is a pretty amazing creation. So, in the beginning of the book, Steinbeck describes the tractors that are going across the land as monsters that don't love the land the way that a farmer would. Steinbeck seems to argue that when a person loses their physical connection to the soil, they lose their soul. Do you think the agrarian ideal is still relevant today, or was it already a dying dream even back in 1939?
When you said this question, I thought, oh, gee, I'm a born and bred city girl. And I guess I have a less romantic notion about the land. I do believe people should be able to take care of themselves and repair things. And I have tremendous respect for the source of our food. But I don't know, not everyone can be a farmer or will be a farmer. And maybe that sounds elitist, but I believe there's been progress from industrialization in terms of both crop safety and production. I think it's terribly unfortunate that people in this country go hungry, or that food is wasted, or that the current administration is ignoring people and their needs in order to support their rich friends. So I think it's important to appreciate the land and take care of it. I don't think everyone should farm. I guess that's what I would say. We have
Yeah.
moved some things forward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I study a lot of utopian and dystopian writing, in my scholarship. And I really don't like the utopias that are all about, well, we should all be farmers because
Yeah.
I'm
Or
not
we
a
should all be
farmer.
right. Right now, we should all be weed growers, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I just feel like we can't idealize or fantasize about that any more than we can about city. And I do think it's interesting that if you look at the culture today and where is greater tolerance for diversity, even though you're not supposed to use that word, I would argue that's not happening in the more rural areas, to the degree it's happening in more urban areas. Now, maybe that's because that's where the jobs are now. So the story's the same. I just think the details are different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you can use diversity on this show because we
Oh,
believe
okay.
in diversity,
So,
equity, and inclusion. Yeah, but just following on from this idea of the land, how do you think that the bank or the company, in the form of the company landowners, how do they function as a character or characters in this book? Is the bank the true villain? Are the landowners the true villains? Or is this just an invisible force that I guess Steinbeck is generalizing?
I mean, that company store thing is just terrible, right? You garnish your wages, you don't get to eat, you got to buy your food there. It's expensive and it's poor quality. I mean, I think what we have learned, right, is, and even back then, is that pure capitalism or relying on business to take care of people is not going to get us as far as we would hope. Like, I'm not waiting for people who are worried about their stock price to really take care of people. It's an equation. Hopefully, they will treat their employees fairly so that they can have a workforce that's going to deliver for them. But I'm not a believer in the company will help. I'm not a believer that that's the case, I guess.
Well,
I've worked
that's
for many companies, they want to do, you have good people in companies and you have bad people in companies and you have good people in the helping professions and bad people in the helping professions. So, I just wish that we appreciated they have a job to do, but in order to have that job, they need healthy, well fed, and enough happy employees, right? I used to say to people, the company always wants you to be happy doing the thing they need you to do. And if they're smart enough to try to make you happy, you'll do a better job. I
yeah,
mean, it's different.
absolutely.
Picking fruit is a hard job, but we're not that many years past slavery here. So, I mean, when the book is set, so maybe takes a long time before people appreciate that. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. And that's, the idea that the company needs to actually take care of its employees is a perfect segue to our next question. Um, the term okie is used as a slur throughout the entire novel to strip the characters of their dignity. And it was widely used in California during that time that lumped in white migrants, predominantly white migrants from Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Kansas. It didn't matter where they came from. They were called Okies. The migrants are often described in animalistic terms, huddled together, moving like a herd. They are called dirty and stupid. The Jodes happen to be white. They are Protestant. They are American born, though they speak in a dialect that is regarded by others as ignorant. Steinbeck briefly mentions that the landowners previously used quote, slaves, unquote, referring to Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, and Filipino workers. But the novel focuses almost exclusively on a white experience. Steinbeck has been criticized for portraying the migrant struggle as a white story, largely ignoring the Mexican and Filipino workers who were already in those fields and had been fighting for labor rights for years. Why do you think he chose to focus on the Jodes? Was he trying to show that even white Americans could be treated this way to shock his audience? Or did he have a blind spot regarding the racial history of California labor?
So, I think it's a great question, Naomi. I think there's something in the middle, though. I don't think he's going for shock. I think he is going to express what he saw as a big problem. But whenever you read something set in the past, you have to think about the culture of that time, right? So he's not fighting and he's not articulating the racial history of the whole country. I guess I would cut him a little bit of slack. He wanted an audience for the book. And when you read about the time period and all of the struggles then, there were lots of omissions. The women's suffrage movement didn't deal with Black women either. These things, I mean, the unfortunate thing about change is that in a big country like this is that it takes a long time. And I think that activists sometimes have to take smaller steps to get their message appreciated. I mean, we see that with what's happening today when the people that were hurt by government forces were of a certain color, people weren't paying attention. So I guess my millennial children would say this is white privilege in a bad way. And it is, but again, the story's so universal and so applicable that I'm reluctant to criticize the book for that focus. I would hope it would inspire other people to make sure maybe they tell the rest of those stories. There have been books since that time written to address some of those issues, but I think it would be criticizing this book for not doing that is like saying you shouldn't have written a book about this. You should have written about something else. And maybe he should have, but I don't know. Can't do it now. So I'm sure he'd have a lot to say now. I'm sure he would write it differently now.
Well, and he did have a lot to say about a lot of different things,
Right,
particularly
in his other
labor.
book. Yeah.
I mean, I think it can be in the middle, and I think it could be he had a blind spot, but he also was trying to bring in the biggest audience he could.
Right.
And this was, it was definitely a real thing, as I can attest from my own family, even though they weren't headed to California.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So do you think, or why do you think Steinbeck used dialect throughout the book, especially since it adds to the idea that the Jodes and other migrant workers were uneducated and somehow less than in mainstream American society?
It's interesting because the use of dialect in the book is just extraordinary to me. I mean, I thought her name was Rosa Sharon for the longest time, right? I really had to look at it and look at it. And whenever I see the flower, we have a tree, a Rose of Sharon tree. And whenever I see it, I hear it. You hear it in the movie. I'm sure that's why the movie was so impactful too, because it allowed that language to be expressed. People code switch. We know that today. And when they are living in their world and when the educational system is not helping them improve that, then you're going to have that. And I think it's the book's strength that he uses that. I get that somebody says, see, they're uneducated, but quite frankly, the level of formal education was fairly limited in some of these people. And so I think we have to become, as a person who strove to lose a New York accent, I think we have to become a little more tolerant that intellect and dialect are not the same. You can be intelligent and not speak in a certain way. And if you want to be accepted by people who care about that, then you learn. I mean, if you go Maslowian, they had to eat first and be safe, and then they could work on their accents.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
to call somebody who speaks like that ignorant is like saying if you don't learn something, you don't know it. I don't know. It just seems like an excuse to complain.
Yeah. I had an experience once where someone was complaining about someone else who had a foreign accent. It wasn't necessarily U.S. dialect, but it was a foreign accent. And I basically said, oh, it's okay. Their thoughts don't have an accent.
Right. Right. I mean, it's challenging when you're working or you're managing or you're making friends and you don't always understand what people have to say. So if you're not a negative person, you can always ask, I didn't catch that. It's funny. My husband doesn't hear it well. He has more trouble. I can sort of appreciate somebody's speech pattern. It's interesting to me, right? So I pay attention more and I kind of see the pattern in the language. But there are plenty of languages I don't have a clue. And if somebody's accent is confusing to me, I ask. Because arguably, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you right. Could you spell it? It helps me. I mean, I think that's friendlier than ignoring somebody.
Yeah.
I do.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So based on the real life Arvin Federal Migratory Labor Camp, the government run Weed Patch Camp wasn't just a place with running water and toilets. It was a social experiment. The camp is an example of how government intervention restores a sense of agency to families who have nowhere else to turn in the novel. The local police are desperate to shut Weed Patch down because it basically treats people with respect. Rather than making people dependent, however, the government camp provides a foundation for self-sufficiency in a story defined by constant displacement and cruelty. The Weed Patch Camp offers the Jodes a rare sense of humanity and serves as a powerful symbol of self-governance in an otherwise hostile environment. How does this setting illustrate the specific role government and community can play in restoring dignity to people who have been stripped of everything else?
Yeah. You know, it also served to me while I read the book. I thought, oh, thank God. The book is relentless. And when they get there, I feel like, and I almost, the first time, and I guess I must have read it before I saw the movie. I was like, oh, maybe this book isn't going to be as bleak as it's been. So in the book, it serves to give you a breather from this kind of relentless, horrible stuff that's going on. I think it is a model for government. We need shelters in cities now. We need government to enable people to not live on the street. And we need food banks, and we need to be taking care of our people. Of course, everybody wants to work. People don't want to be taking all the time. It's just in your nature. On the other hand, there isn't an opportunity, and we should take care of people as the alternative Hoovervilles and people living on the street. I want government to be part of that. I'll pay my taxes for that. I'd rather my taxes went for that than for many other things that government is trying to do. So, and you talk about the accents. If you build camps and you send children to school, they'll learn to read and speak in a better way or in a more articulate way, and that will help them longer term. So I don't know why I know we're an individualistic society, but I don't know why we're so mean to each other. I find it kind of awful. So I guess the book needed that. I needed it when I read it, for sure. And I don't disagree with that point of view. I guess you said that he said he wasn't political. I mean, it's political. He wasn't a communist.
Yeah.
But
he said he
has
wasn't a communist. Yeah.
Yeah, he has a point of view.
He does.
He has a point of view.
So let's talk about the controversial final scene. The novel ends with Rose of Sharon having lost her baby, nursing a starving man to save his life. Even today, people have strong reactions to this scene. And that final scene is, at least in my opinion, a literal and visceral example of the milk of human kindness. Some critics at the time called the scene obscene, even though the scene does not come across as sexualized. When you first read the ending, and maybe you'll have to think about the different times you read the ending, this act of radical survival, was it a moment of hope for you, or did it feel too dark or shocking?
It's funny. I'm sure when I read it in high school, I had no idea what was going on. I think I didn't know a lot about nursing. But as an adult, what I can tell you is it felt like it was about the desperate steps that people take to survive. And I never really thought about it in terms of the definition of family. I'm not sure it would have been less shocking if this had been a family member or something. I don't think that. And I can imagine that in more primitive times, people might have nursed others for survival. Like, I don't know about, Native American, or I suspect that this is not the first time this would have ever happened. I guess in 1939, our conservative people, we believed were too advanced or sophisticated to engage in this kind of primitive behavior. I mean, it's really compelling. It's really compelling. We had talked, or you had asked me if I thought it was hopeful. I mean, the book's not hopeful to me. So it just makes me sad to think how much fighting has to happen in order to get to like a basic level of where we ought to be. I did think it was interesting that in 1940, they couldn't show that in Hollywood. So not only do you have this shocking scene, then you have a very conservative, movie people. Our sensibilities were so conservative. But, at least it was in the book. That gets me back to media. He used what he had. Good job, John. Write it up the way it is.
Well, I think the movie ended with Tom when he had to go on the run and the burgeoning of him as a social activist. And then they cut the rest of what happened to the family. And so the book is much more shocking than the movie. This was not something they could show.
Yeah. I think it's shocking, but I don't think it's, certainly not obscene. It just seems like, and I'm sure in all that you read a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff, I'm sure it'll come back, It's not an unusual thought when you actually think people have nothing. But I will say, it's very intense to read. It's very intense to read.
Yes.
So, also the baby's dead. How sad is that? It's just sad all the way around.
Yeah.
All the way around.
Well, so what is the final legacy or message you want our listeners to take away from reading this book?
It's first of all, everybody should read it as an adult. You should read it as an adult because I think your understanding of the world is so much better. And even if you read it in high school, I would encourage people to read it. And in terms of the final legacy, Tom Joad and then said it, and John Ford gave it to Henry Fonda in the movie, and Woody Guthrie sang about it. So did Bruce Springsteen, at his Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inauguration. And the line in the book is, I'll be everywhere, wherever you look, wherever there's a fight, so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. And so his encouragement to people to participate in the world is another thing that I think, you could argue it was his desperation, but he's inspiring people who have to continue to help people who don't. And I just think it's a beautiful book. I did get this sense of desperation. It takes desperation in order to make people help. And I just hope that's not the case. I hope we learn now we have this book. Somebody said something to me about the differences between what's happening today and everything that was happening in 1939 and 1940 is that today we have years of literature and books and stories about what happens when this happens. And they didn't have that in 1939. And so story's compelling. It stands alone as a book. It's not hard to read. It takes you on the journey that we want all books to take us on. And it says something really important and relevant today. And I just think if that's what it takes, if that's what makes it a banned book, well, then read on, because I don't want to forget that. I hate to think that we have to continue to fight again so hungry people can eat. But I have to be hopeful. I have kids and grandkids. So, the world's got to revert to some sense of support for problems. I hope anyway. I hope. So fight on. Fight on, right? That's the message. Fight on.
I hope so too. I think that's a good message. Thank you, Belle, so much for your insights and your willingness to discuss this book, even though it has been very controversial over the years. Our next book, the next episode, will be Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I will sign off by saying that, as Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading. Thank you.
Here. Thank you.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen.